Andrew Phelan is one of just 4 graduates nationwide selected for a prestigious postgraduate scholarship through the Australian-China Council, administered by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT. With decades of senior commercial experience across Asia, he is now widely recognised as a leading expert and commentator on the geopolitics and economics of the Indo-Pacific region. Andrew has lived and worked extensively overseas, including long-term assignments in China, Hong Kong, although Hong Kong now is part of China, Singapore, and the UK. He is highly regarded for his ability to distill complex international issues into clear, balanced, and accessible insights. In recent years, Andrew has been a prominent voice in the media analysing escalating tensions surrounding Taiwan and the People's Republic of China, government's explicit ambition to annex the island, meaning Taiwan, by all means necessary, including military force if required. Andrew's commentary appears regularly across print media and digital broadcast outlets, both in Australia and internationally. He is a frequent guest on Sky News Australia. Please make Andrew very welcome. Andrew, the microphone is yours and so is the floor.
Jolly good. Thank you for the kind but somewhat long-winded introduction, Ross, much appreciated. It's a fancy way of saying Andrew is a bloke that likes to talk about China. But anyway, great to be here. I was up here a couple of weeks ago, learned a lot in a short time. Never been in the Wimmera before, and I'm back here a couple of weeks later to talk to you about something that I think, in my unbiased personal opinion, is the story of our time, daylight second. It doesn't get the level of attention that I think it ought to get, so that's something I've been trying to personally address. I want to start by saying I'm very informal, so if you've got a question or something, be in your bonnet, don't sit on it, sing out at any time. I'm happy to answer or do Q&A at the end. I've got a map of, first of all, hands up if you've been to China? Not too many. Hands up if you've read a book about China? A few people, okay, all right. Does anyone know how to say China in Chinese? It's up there, it's 2 characters. Hello. I might need somebody to, Ross, I might commandeer you here. My laser thingy doesn't work because there's no Wi-Fi here, but anyway, we'll soldier on. So the 2 characters there, Zhongguo, right? The Zhong, if you go to McDonald's in China, you got small, medium, and large. That first character, I can kind of need that. Anyway, yeah, okay, that works. Okay, the first character is small, medium, or large is medium, right? Middle. The idea is the middle. You might have heard China being the middle kingdom, right? And look at the characters. You see a rectangle with a line through it? That's what that character signifies. And the second one looks like a crown tipped on its side with a perimeter around it. So the idea of a crown surrounded by a perimeter, that's a kingdom, right? This is essentially what the word in Chinese for China is, the middle kingdom. If you look at that map up there, anything stick out at you? Topographical map of China. It's a big country. Anything stick out? Come on, don't be shy. Anything? Phones? Sorry? Yeah, absolutely. Anything else? And Mr. Wiegman walks in. Welcome. We've just started. So you'll notice that it's just press any button. Yeah. You just want to keep it from going. Yeah. Okay, great. You'll notice that you've got a lot of mountains, a lot of desert. You've got a green area in the east. You've got a little green circle, that's the Sichuan Basin. Got 100 million people that live there. And then you've got the sea to the east. So China historically over the millennia has been very isolated from the rest of the world. So that's a very important point. And so the culture is quite homogenous. Next slide, thanks. No. Yeah. Just here. Yeah. Try doing the mouse. Okay? Yeah. Alright, now the first thing I've always got to say when I talk about China is we must not conflate good Aussie ethnic Chinese people when we're talking about the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. So that slide up there, I was in Darwin end of October, beginning of November. That's the Mu family, Mavis Mu and her two brothers, and they fought for Australia in World War II. So they're proud Aussie Chinese. However, we have something called the United Front, the United Front Work Department, something that Xi Jinping calls his secret weapon. And it's not very well known in Australia, not even by our politicians. So one of the things I want you to take away today is what is the United Front Work Department and how does it work? Next slide, thanks. Very important point I want to make is that the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP party state, work on a very different operating system to what we do in Australia or the UK or the US or Canada or other Western liberal democracies. There is no independent judiciary. The party is the law. People get arrested, they go to jail. Let me give you some examples. There's a great book called Beijing Rules, which goes into great detail on this stuff. Now back one slide, please. So that picture there is Jimmy Lai, who was a street kid in Guangzhou, became a billionaire in Hong Kong and ran a newspaper and refused to shut it down. So they put him in jail. He's 76. He has been in solitary confinement in a jail in Hong Kong for the last few years, and last week, last week he got a 20-year prison sentence. He's a diabetic in solitary confinement in a jail. So basically a death sentence because he refused to shut down his newspaper and toe the party line. So all of this has happened. I used to live in Hong Kong. It's a very different place now. All this has happened since Beijing enforces national security law in Hong Kong. Okay.
I don't know what's going on there, Andrew.
Yeah. I think just keep moving. Back one slide, please. So that thing there is called a tiger chair. They are routinely used today. If that looks like something out of the Middle Ages, it's because it is. It renders the prisoner, they can't move, and they interrogate it for hours. They still use those. The other thing I'd point out is that Beijing is the sponsor or the coordinator behind North Korea, Russia, and Iran. And in fact, Putin would not be able to prosecute his war in Ukraine without the support of Beijing, particularly in terms of oil purchases and also the export of dual-use technologies that have a military application, things like drones. On the far top right, we've got Dr. Li Wenliang. He was a guy that raised the alarm on COVID back in 2019. And for his troubles, him and the other doctors were dragged off and taken down to the police station and told that if they created any more trouble, they'd be arrested. So they didn't get the word out. They couldn't get the word out. And so what happened was, as we know, the virus spread around the world. Beijing censored any information on the virus, allowed its people to travel around the world while simultaneously used the Chinese diaspora through the United Front to go out and buy PPE. That's what happened, okay? And you remember that when our government suggested, and I got a background in this space, we had SARS, we had MERS, so I was all over this when it happened. When our government suggested that we have an independent global inquiry to get to the bottom of this pandemic, Beijing slapped us with $20 billion worth of trade sanctions, unilateral trade sanctions. And we were taking them to the WTO, and those cases were pending, and then there was a change of government, and they eventually ended those sanctions because they knew that they wouldn't hold up in a court. Next slide, please. So we ought to be asking a question. China's a different business model. We ought to be asking ourselves a question: does China have a strategy? What do they want? Do they have a strategy? Well, the answer to that question is absolutely they have a strategy. Yes, they have a strategy. Look at this. Here's two books. Pillsbury was Trump's China advisor in Trump's first term. The other guy, Rush Doshi, worked in the Biden administration. He wrote a book that I think is one of the most important books on China. It's called The Long Game. You may have heard it said in conversations that the Chinese take the long view, and that is true. They don't have elections. They do 5-year plans, strategic plans, and they bring the resources of the state to everything they do strategically, okay? There's a few inflection points on the history of the last 30 years that show us where we got to today. So, and in about 2008 to 2012, they used to have a mantra where they said, hide your strength and bide your time. They were a developing country. They liked to fly under the radar. They were slowly getting stronger. Whenever they had a meeting at an international conference of the US, they'd say, the US is the biggest developed country. We're the biggest developing country. Hide your strength and bide your time. And three things really influenced the mentality in Beijing. One of them was the backlash to the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. I first went to China in 88. I was still 21. I was kind of just a kid. And I was back there in 1990, and the atmosphere was completely different. They were surprised and shocked by the blowback that came from the Western world. This was kind of the first, massacre that was televised around the world on CNN and everything. Then the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. So the precursor to the Tiananmen Square thing was Gorbachev's visit to China. And for Beijing, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a disaster. And they're trying to avoid that at all costs. The third thing was the Gulf War in 1991. They could not believe how quickly and easily the US was victorious in the Gulf. That set off a train of strategic thinking about their own military. And in the mid-1990s, the then president of Taiwan introduced universal suffrage. God forbid he allowed people to elect their leaders. And that incensed Beijing. And that's very much tied into their motivation for ruling Taiwan. Can't allow people to have elections. In Hong Kong, and I had mates that were working with locals that were running for local council, like we would here. And most of those people are in jail because they wanted to run for local council. So can't have elections. They have a monopoly on power. Okay. They do these things called 5-year plans, and I make the point, I might not be the biggest fan of the Chinese Communist Party going around, right? But I respect them. They do strategic 5-year plans, they write them down, and then they go and achieve 80% of what they set out to do. Now, can you imagine a government of either persuasion in Australia having a written 3-year plan, 4-year plan, and then going out and actually getting it done and implementing it? Don't hold your breath. So I admire that. 2008 was a turning point year. What happened in 2008? Anyone? A couple of things. Financial crisis. Good one, absolutely. What else happened on the 8th of the 8th at 8 p.m. in Beijing in 2008? I'll give you a clue, there's a winter version of it going on right now. Yeah, the Beijing Olympics. So we had, in 2008, we had the financial crisis, the subprime mortgage crisis in the US, and the Chinese are going, you know what? Hide your strength and bide your time. Our model is pretty good. Our model of governance is pretty good. Look at the Americans. It's falling apart. And then they had their big coming out party that they'd been building towards the 2008 Olympics, and they showed the world, they'd kind of arrived, right? Also, for me, 2011 was kind of the year that penny dropped for me. So one of my mates in the US says, we all got mugged by reality. And what he means by that is, there were 3 things. So Xi Jinping said to Obama in the Rose Garden, we're not going to militarise the reefs and atolls in the South China Sea. Our presence there is just for scientific and research purposes. And what did they do? They went ahead and militarised them. They built bunkers and radars, and they militarised all of these features in the South China Sea. So that was a wake-up bomb for me, because I thought these guys have extraterritorial, they have imperial ambitions. That was point number one. Point number two, in the late 90s, I spent a day at Auschwitz-Birkenau. I was on my own, and I got busted eavesdropping on a tour group, and they said, why don't you join us? They were a bunch of Americans. And so I got a blow-by-blow description of the way that place was set up, how people were trucked in. The place was a logistics hub, and what happened after that. And I've been to a lot of factories in my career all over the world, and this place was a factory for stripping people of their valuables and putting them to death. And at the end of the day, I said to myself, why did I come here? What was the point of the exercise? Well, the point of the exercise is, if you see that shit happening in your life, it's in your in tray, you don't look the other way, you speak up and you do something about it. So when I saw the Uyghurs being put on an industrial scale, I'm an equal opportunity offender, I don't care if you're Jewish or Muslim, right? If people have been picked on, I'm going to speak up about it. On an industrial scale, we had kids taken away from their parents, put in kindergartens with CCTV cameras, barbed wire fences, right? So I started speaking about that. That was point number two. And point number three, this is a red line for me. They started interfering in my country. They started interfering in Australia. They interfere everywhere. They say they don't, but they do. Through the United Front, through all such other means. Remember Sam Dastyari, disgraced politician? Standing in front of the coat of arms in our parliament, echoing CCP talking points. They're very good at what they call elite capture, getting you to say what they want to say, right? So when I started seeing that, I felt somewhat, g'day mate. I felt somewhat obliged, especially given the fact that my postgraduate studies were funded by the taxpayer. I felt somewhat obliged to start talking about these things. So that was my concern coming out. And I knew when I did, next slide, thanks. I knew when I did that there was some risk to me involved personally. And I'll jump into that point in a minute. So my media journey, and I've never had any interest in being a journo or a talking head or anything like that. This all happened a bit by accident. But my media journey began with the ABC, and I wasn't going on air myself, but I was tapping experts and friends of mine. I have a really good network in this space around the world. So people like Andrew Erickson, who's an expert on the Chinese Navy, people like Nadej Roland, who wrote the first book on the Belt and Road, Bill Hayden, who wrote a book about the South China Sea, and so on. I was tapping, and then one day somebody asked me to go on air, and I was live TV, right? I had a little panic attack, and I thought, just take a breath, right? And that's kind of how it started. And then they asked me to go back. But that's Laura Tingle left from the ABC. She's the editor of International Affairs at the moment. She's got no China background whatsoever, no Asia background whatsoever, no commercial experience whatsoever. And the other day she said, in a contingency over Taiwan, would Australia choose to side with China or the US? Now to me, that's unthinkable, but that's kind of across the board the level of Asia-China literacy in the media, and I'm not having a go at individuals. It's a structural thing. It's very difficult to get journalists into China. They won't give you visas. And you don't learn the language and the way around overnight. It takes a long, long time. But that's one of the reasons. Now, the guy in the middle, I ended up falling out with the ABC and having disagreements with him. The guy in the middle is a mate of mine, Adam Gilmore, who I met in Singapore 15 years ago as a banker. And he had two kids named after Star Wars characters. And I said, look, I'm a banker, but what I really want to do is go into space. And I went, yeah, sure, why not? Good luck with that. Fast forward to today, Gilmore Space is Australia's biggest space company. It's worth over $1 billion, and they did a rocket test at Bowen in North Queensland late last year. Adam was hoping for 10 seconds of flight time. He got 14 before the thing crashed and burned, which happens most of the time. But they're getting ready to go again. Now, I argued with the ABC. I said, give this guy some coverage. Give our kids an Aussie version of Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, etc., etc. It can be done here. Give them something to look up to. You know, a reason to stick with their STEM subjects and dream big. And Adam's a very down-to-earth guy, but do not underestimate his determination. I went out to their operation in the Gold Coast hinterland. He's got 200 young Aussies, and they've got a couple of massive rockets, and they're making satellites. It's a reminder of what we can do when we put our minds to it. This guy on the other side is a guy called Chen Hong, and he was a scholar in Australia. He translated Patrick White's book, A Fringe of Leaves, and you've got Bob Hall. And he's the go-to guy in China for any commentary regarding Australia. He knows me, I know him. And he came down to Australia on what I like to call the warning tour. And the template that he was authorised to use went something like this. Wouldn't it be a pity if something unfortunate were to happen to a Royal Australian naval vessel in the South China Sea? Yeah, it would be a pity. I was furious that the ABC gave him a platform. And, come down to my country and threaten to put a couple of hundred of my countrymen and women to a watery grave? Not happy, Jan. Not happy, Jan. So, that was the last straw for me. I stopped doing stuff in the ABC. 6 months later, he had his visa to Australia revoked. So I felt somewhat vindicated, not that I ever got a call from Auntie. Anyway, that's kind of how it started. And sure enough, next slide, please. Maybe try the mouse. There we go. In China's site. So 3 years ago, I got arrested. Yeah, by our own Victoria Police Force. In my own home, in Melbourne. And it couldn't have come at a worse time, because I had down tools to look after my terminally ill mother. And on the day before Australia Day in 2023, I had a guy from Statewide Hospital Rentals come to put a hospital bed. My mum had breast cancer, dementia, and she'd fallen and broken her hip. And I was bringing physios in to get her up and moving. I was stressed out of my brain. I was expecting them and a tradie. And I went to open the door at 10:30, and there's 4 Victoria Police detectives out the front door. And they go, "You Andrew Phelan?" I go, "Yeah." They didn't say, "Can I come in?" They barged in. One of them swiped my phone out of my hand. Another one went over and took my computers, some external drives. I was taken to Moorabbin Police Station. I was fingerprinted. And then one of them drove me home. He said, "We don't usually drive." He said, "You seem like a pretty nice guy." Well, one of them drove me home. And then 2 days later, they came with all my devices. What had happened to me, and it's happened to a whole bunch of people, and we've all got something in common, and have a while, guess what that is? So Luke de Pulford is the global founder of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. He is a British politician in the Conservatives, and we have a half a dozen members of Parliament here, both Labor and Coalition, upper and lower house. We've got a half a dozen here, and I know a couple of them. Senator Patterson is one of them. He went into bat over what happened to me in Senate estimates with the Australian Federal Police. I spoke last October at a parliamentary roundtable on what they call transnational repression, which is when one country thinks it can go into somebody else's country and give somebody a hard time. And I'm not the only one they've done it to here. I had a great meeting with Senator Raf Kachoni, who's a Labor senator down in Melbourne, who's got Collingwood paraphernalia all over his office, unfortunately. But other than that, he's a really good guy and was very interested in this sort of stuff. So there's growing awareness. Yes.
So we had Chairman Dan.
Yes.
Go over to China.
Yes.
How much is Victoria owned by China already?
That's a great question, and I'm going to hold that one because I've got a couple of slides specifically on that coming up. Don't you worry. And in fact, look, this thing has been a blessing in disguise. My street cred in this space has gone up, and I'm getting much more demand to speak, particularly in the US, more so than here. But, I keep going with support of good Australian people like yourselves. Next slide, thanks. So the magic weapon, they call it, right? So what they do is Beijing has this mentality that if you're ethnic Chinese, you're Beijing's property. And I've got heaps of Chinese friends, and they reject that outright. They're like, no, I'm Aussie Chinese, right? I'm Aussie, right? They reject that outright. But Beijing, through civil society, through groups like, generally the giveaway, the red flags are, if an organisation is called if it's got the word friendship in it, or if it's got the word peaceful in it, it's usually being influenced by the United Front. What they do is they try and influence. They also try and get people in government. So Dan Andrews had a guy called Marty May or May Jung, and he was Andrews' multicultural advisor. Now, he was from China. China's about the most monocultural place going around. So how you can be a multicultural advisor there, I don't know. But as soon as so Marty May went to China with Dan Andrews on all his trips. And as soon as Andrews resigned, the two of them set up a couple of companies straight away. I'll come back to that point in a minute. Next slide, please. So just a week ago, the Jamestown Foundation, which is a Washington-based think tank, completed a very long study of 4 democratic countries, Germany, the UK, Canada, and the US, and they found thousands of organisations that are under the influence of the United Front Work Department. So, park that thought. Next slide, please. There's a difference between interference and influence. Probably one of the most important points I want to make tonight is top left, taking the low road. That report from ASPI focuses on China's deliberate strategy to influence and interfere to capture elites at a sub-national level. By that I mean state governments and local governments. And they do it everywhere. They do it in the US, they do it in Canada. In fact, the situation in Canada is 10 times worse than here. 10 times worse than here. In fact, that book on the top right, Sam Cooper, I did a podcast with him. He's a very brave man for exposing this, and a couple of Senator Hastings, Senator Patterson have a copy of that book. The work that he did led to the Hague Commission on Foreign Interference and got Trudeau removed from office. But Carney is backsliding on that. Spies and lies. We have some of the best experts in the world on this stuff. Young Alex Josky. In that book, he describes how Bob Hawke was coaxed in to being a spokesman for China's Boao Forum, their version of the World Economic Forum. They're very skillful at elite capture, and there are different ways they do it, but they play the long game. There's a difference between influence and interference, and the ALP have been the beneficiary of that interference, and they haven't said anything about it, which I think is kind of disgraceful. In fact, Jerome Laxale, who's the member for Bennelong in New South Wales, went on to Red Note, Xiaohongshu, and pilloried the Morrison government. He went after Morrison, he went after Dutton, he called Dutton a warmonger on a platform that has no legal representation in Australia at all. Now, China bans every single Western app, they're all banned, and yet we've allowed them untrammeled access to our markets in the West, what I call a lack of digital sovereignty. Next slide, please. Victoria and PRC Inc. It's a worry, it's a concern. I was at Brisbane Airport when I found out that Chairman Dan had resigned, and immediately I thought of the Wizard of Oz. Ding dong, the witch is dead. That was my original, I was thinking, you beauty. Within 3 or 4 working days, Beijing's man in Canberra, I don't call them ambassadors, it's a different operating system. Chinese diplomats are kept on a very short leash. He was down in Melbourne for a photo op with Jacinta Allen. Why? To protect PRC Inc.'s interest in the state of Victoria. And she came out with this template, somebody put in front of her. Our relationship with China is deeper than just trade. It's a partnership built on respect, trust and friendship, and one that benefits all Victorians in every sector. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that nice? Didn't benefit me so much when I was arrested. Or the Hortons. You guys remember Matt Horton, Olympic champion swimmer?
Yes.
Very good friends with his parents. That family's been harassed here. All coordinated out of the Tuareg embassy. When Matt came back from the Rio Olympics with gold medal around his neck, no Victorian politician wanted to be photographed with him because of the hullabaloo with Sun Yang, the Chinese athlete that was cheating for drugs. His old school Caulfield Grammar. It's not every high school produces a gold medal Olympic champion. Instead of calling the school swimming centre the Matt Horton Aquatic Centre, it's the Caulfield Grammar Aquatic Centre. Why? Caulfield Grammar has a campus in China. So you see how this sort of self-censorship works? And it's one of the reasons I talk about this, because I made the decision, if I don't go back to China again for the rest of my life, so be it, right? I've kind of burned my bridges. Drew Pablo, a mate of mine, featured in the same episode of 60 Minutes. His family got harassed, his mother got harassed. A couple of years ago on Australia Day, the chain of pubs in Australia were banning Australia Day. How about that? Banning Australia Day in your own country. And this guy, Wei Jianshan, a mate of mine worked with him, was a colleague of his in Hong Kong. Turns out that he's the CEO of the group that owned the pubs that said Australians are not allowed to celebrate Australia Day in their own pubs, in their own country. You see what I'm saying? It's a red line for me and not acceptable. Anyone tell me who that lady with the red head is in the top of that picture? Anyone know who that is? That's Margaret Gardner. She's the Governor of Victoria. And there she is with the CEO of Comac. What's Comac? It's China's version of Boeing and Airbus, right? State-owned. Now, I used to work for GE, and one of the most famous cases of industrial espionage was that GE is a world leader in aircraft engines, in jet engines, and a couple of companies, US companies I worked for, have successfully prosecuted PRC nationals for stealing their IP in breach of their contracts. So they go in, thumb drives, they get all the blueprints and all that, because it's cheating is a faster way of catching up. What on earth is the Governor of Victoria, back then she was Chancellor of RMIT in Monash, what on earth is she doing enabling the capacity of the country that's our biggest sovereign military threat to get ahead? You know, in the Low Road report, when Steve Bracks was Premier, he went to China and came away with an agreement with our sister province, Jiangsu province, for our auto workers to train their auto workers to help them build their car industry. Well, how's that turned out? Not so great. And she, by the way, she's married to Glyn Davis, who until very recently was Albo's head of the Prime Minister's department. So so there's a little bit of clubbishness and jobs for the boys and that sort of stuff. Next slide, thanks, Ross. This one's a real bugbear for me, suburban rail loop. The contracts are not public. Can you believe that? I lived in Singapore for 15 years. It's a very open tender process. Corruption is not tolerated, and you would go to jail. Now, I've got a couple other projects up here that sort of fall under the Belt and Road, right? This big project. In China, historically, the provinces raised money to the central government by selling land for property development. Now, anyone that follows China in the news knows that their property market has gone lots of big debts. It's 10 times the size of the 08 crisis in the US. So that way of raising money doesn't work anymore. But all over China, there's white elephant infrastructure. The high-speed rail network, which is 40,000 kilometres, it's $1 trillion sinkhole. A lot of Chinese people can't afford tickets on it. Not the trunk lines, but 6% of it's profitable. 6%, as opposed to in Japan where it's all profitable. This is Xi Jinping's pet project. The new capital outside Beijing in Henan province, Xiongnan. 93 billion they put into it. It's sitting there empty. It's a white elephant. This is the whoosh. It's the Jakarta to Bandung high-speed railway in Java, in Indonesia. It's not meeting anywhere near its numbers, so Jakarta's having to, in negotiations with Beijing over the lending and the financing for that is putting their budgets under pressure. You see where I'm going with this? I'm very, very concerned about the suburban rail loop. I'll let you in on a little secret. It's the biggest infrastructure project in our country's history. And I speak to politicians, and I speak to politicians from the Liberal Party, and they just don't seem to get it, including the state president, I've got to say, but I continue to work. So the first third of the loop is a $36 billion project. And to give you an idea, just in the last week or two, we've heard about the Sydney-Newcastle high-speed rail. That's 186 kilometres, and the estimates for it are cheaper than this, which is Cheltenham to Box Hill, which is 20 kilometres. And not only that, but I've been to community meetings, and I asked people, are you going to get on the subway and go from Cheltenham? Nobody's interested. Nobody's interested in it. And they've already started work. So, you know, as I get around and speak to politicians, I think the tagline for the next election shouldn't be a fresh start, which is what the Libs are running with at the moment. I think the tagline ought to be Save Victoria, because that's what it amounts to. It's that serious. You know, we've got a state debt heading up towards 200 billion, and then this, which isn't even funded. A third of the funding is supposed to come from the state government. A third of the funding is supposed to come from the feds, 1 billion a year, and a third of the funding is supposed to come from something called value capture. Whatever the hell that is, I have no idea. I don't know whether it's a transport project or a housing project. And there's no transparency on the contracts. Next slide, please. I want to, I'm getting to the end, bear with me, but when I first went to China, the 3 big ticket items, if you wanted to keep up with the Wongs and the Joes and the Lees and the Lius, were the Xiaopiao, the wristwatch, the Shouyinji, the radio, and the Zixinche, the push bike. They were the aspirational. That's how poor China was when I first went there, you know, nearly 40 years ago. And this was the first car joint venture, Beijing Jeep. And then you'd see these knockoffs all around, Volkswagen, when they were second, Shanghai Volkswagen. The Chinese got the foreign automakers to hand over their special sauce. They contracted it. They had to hand over IP, or they wouldn't let them into the market. And when you're dangling the carrot of a market of 1.4 billion, everybody wants to get in with cheap labour, right? And that's how things started. How it started, how's it going? So this was about 2004. This was on the cover of Business Week. 3-word title, The China Price. Every manufacturer in the US Midwest was like, they're quoting 30% cheaper than us. What are we going to do? We'll just give up. So they put their kit in containers and they shipped it over to the other side of the Pacific. And we saw the US industrial base hollow out and people lose their jobs. It was good for Wall Street. It was good for corporate profits. Not so good for Main Street. Not so good for US industry. And what's happened since then, this is a pretty new book. I think it's the most important book in economic history in the last 25 years. It's called Apple in China. The best Apple engineers went to China and they trained the locals. So for a long period of time, Apple had a project on the books, the Apple car. Anyone ever hear of that? Well, it died with a whimper. Why did it die with a whimper? Because all those guys that Apple had trained had gone out and done all this other stuff. Drones, LIDAR, which is the, it helps you park your car, semiconductor, smartphone, humanoid, all this sort of stuff. At the end of last year, exports from China to the US are down about 20%. They're up nearly 30% to Africa and Southeast Asia. At the end of last year, China had a merchandise trade surplus of 1.2 trillion US dollars. It's become the standalone manufacturing juggernaut in the world. How did we allow that to happen? So a lot of people have been critical of Trump and tariffs. Trump's the first Western leader to stand up and fight back. Because if we don't, there's a very good documentary called The War of the Factories, set in World War II. Wars are won and lost as much on the factory floor as they are in the battlefield and on the high seas. Next slide, please. One of my pet peeves is when politicians say we've got to engage with China. They're a major player on climate action. Are they? Are they a major player on climate action? I'll tell you what China does. It goes after its national interest, and it uses every different modality of energy, nuclear, coal, all of them. And its emissions been growing. But one of the reasons that China is big on so-called renewables, and they ripped off a lot of technology from the University of New South Wales, where pioneering work was done in photovoltaic cells. One of the reasons that they're big in that space is because they're the world's biggest importer of oil, and it's a national vulnerability for them. The other reason is their cities were so polluted, it was unbelievable. So they wanted to move away from, I went out to Capital Steelworks in 1990, there was like 100,000 people. The air quality was just horrendous. There's a bunch of other reasons why China's gone down this path. Having said that, they want us to think they're all about climate change. They want us to think they're an actor in that space. Look at what they're doing elsewhere. Look at what they're doing in fishing around the world. They're doing drift net fishing off the coast of Africa and South America and decimating fishing fleets. So when it comes to green credentials, not really. What they do have as we go into the AI, this mega competition between the US and China over AI, is they're also an electricity superpower. They've got the cheapest electricity in the world, and that's going to be critical for them in this two-horse race between them and the US on AI. Next slide, please. Right, I'm almost there. Now, how did we get here? There's all these think tanks and all these academics. When Ronald Reagan was the president of the United States had the world's biggest navy, and it was the world's biggest shipbuilder. Today, the United States makes about 1% of the world's new ship tonnage. Back in 2003, the then Premier of China, Zhu Rongji, said, we're going to go into shipbuilding. And like they did in other strategic sectors, they threw all the resources that China had, financial and otherwise, 1.4 billion people into that effort. Today, China makes 55% of the world's new ship tonnage, but it has about 65% of the world's new order book. It's dominating. And it's got ports all around the world. That's a concern. Next slide, please.
Who owns those ships then? They make?
Yeah, they make them for overseas shipping companies, and they make them for their own shipping companies. So you would have...
They have control of the ship then though? What, through technology?
So they learned to build shipbuilding, not overnight. It's been going for the last, 20, 25 years. Back then, the big players were South Korea and Japan. But they've learned that, and they've thrown $91 billion of subsidies to their shipbuilding industry, right? And so we've sort of gone, oh boy, what does this mean from a military point of view? The new US Navy Secretary, John Phelan, no relation, he is scrambling to work with partners, South Korea, Japan, and domestically to get the US shipbuilding industry back up and running. They're not going to wait for us to catch up, by the way. They have a doctrine called Junmin Ronghe, civil military fusion. If something can be used for civilian purposes and military purposes, then it's something that they're going to pursue. They're building a military command center outside of Beijing that is 10 times the footprint of the Pentagon. 10 times the size. This is a country, this is a power, this is a rival, the likes of which the world has never seen before in size and scale. At the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was never more than 33% of the US economy. These guys are almost on parity. The good news is that the rest of the world combining, Team Freedom, as I like to say, outscales China. But first, we've got to acknowledge the issue, and we've got to get our act together. Next slide, please. How do they go about things? They have a doctrine. There was a book written in 1999 by two PLA officers. It's called Unrestricted Warfare. Basically means anything goes. Anything goes, the kind of mafia tactics. And it comes in a lot of different forms. Let me talk about the non-military versions of warfare, right? Drug warfare. One of my mates in the US that I do a podcast with, he lost his daughter to a fentanyl overdose. I said to Andrew Hastie, he joined the ADF after he saw the Twin Towers come down on 9/11. At the height of the opioid crisis in the United States a couple of years ago, it was the #1 killer of people under 30. 100,000 people were dying from fentanyl overdoses in the United States and Canada in a year. 100,000. To put that in perspective, that's 33 9/11s. And all the precursors, all the chemicals came from, you got it. I used to think they turned a blind eye to it. I was wrong. They incentivised it through their VAT rebate system. Now, this has been a huge issue for the Trump administration. It hasn't got a lot of media in Australia. And by the way, all the meth precursors also come from China. That's one area. They were weaponising this. Media warfare. There's an institute called the ACRI UTS. It's called the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney. And it was founded by money from Huang Mo, who wanted to become an Australian citizen and has since been deported. But my arch nemesis heads up that institute, and your average cadet journalist who's got no China background goes, if I want to know about Australia-China relations, who are you going to call? Well, the Australia-China Relations Institute, of course, and Professor. And that's how it works, that's how they work. And they've been very effective people in the universities. I had a coffee with a professor at Melbourne University, who will remain nameless, a couple of weeks ago, and he said to me, I can talk about Russia, I can't talk about China. Why? Students, right? So I am trying to fight the good fight for team freedom. I'm getting some momentum, but I could use some help for sure. Next slide, please. This is where it gets worrisome for us. People ask me what can happen in the future. Remember when the Solomon Islands signed a deal with Beijing for security? I literally did not sleep at all that night. I went on 2GB, Sydney radio station next morning, did an interview. A lot of young blokes lost their lives on Guadalcanal. They were 19, 20-year-olds. They paid a heavy price to hand the Solomon Islands back to the Solomon Islanders. And we've forgotten about them. We've forgotten their sacrifices. Shame on us, shame on us. And they went in there with $2 million and bought the corner office. And so they want to lead what's called the first island chain and have a presence out in the big blue Pacific. Remember they're building all these ships, building all these ports? We might not think these little Pacific countries are important, but the red area demarcates their exclusive economic zone. That's their fishing area and all that sort of stuff. So China wants to leapfrog the islands off its coast and get out in the big blue Pacific. What does that mean for Australia? That's not good news. Because in World War II, the Solomons and other islands were the nexus between the United States Navy and the Australian Navy. We work together. And if they have enough presence in those islands, then they can interdict. You have a question?
Just a side note on that, Solomon Islands have got a big Chinese fuel airport on Lunda, on the island. Nobody uses it,
Yeah, that's happened in a lot of places, including in China. And that's why I'm worried about the SRL, because they'll build stuff, not necessarily for commercial purposes or return on investment. And there's a lot of white elephant infrastructure sitting around doing nothing. Thanks for that. Elbridge Colby is now the head of strategy at the Pentagon. And I started trading notes with this guy a few years ago. I've got no contact with him since he's gone back into government. He's writing the strategy. So one of the things you might have observed in the media is the Americans giving the Europeans, giving the NATO allies a bit of an ear bashing. Have anyone picked that up? Yeah, Rubio was over there the other week. And they're saying to the Europeans, you need to be responsible for your own security. You're a $22.5 trillion economy and you're not spending on defence. We're going to have our hands full with this 800-pound gorilla in our part of the world. So we need you to do your part. That's what that's all about. That's in Australia's national interest that the US is focused in this part of the world, particularly in Northern Australia. This is why AUKUS matters. This is why Sterling, which is just hosting a UK nuclear submarine at the moment as we speak, matters. Because this is our part of the world. Next slide, please. On shipping, I was up in Darwin not that long ago, as I mentioned. We signed, it's our only North Coast port. We don't have another North Coast port, only Darwin. And the then administrator for the territory, Adam Giles, signed it away on a 99-year lease. Now, China doesn't want to give it back. They don't want to give it back. See the other maps there, Africa and South America. You would have heard Trump talking about the Panama Canal, yeah? Very strategic, very important. Why was he talking about it? At two ends of the Panama Canal, Hutchison, which is a Hong Kong company, had operations. So, changing the geopolitics, Trump says, we want them back, we built the canal. So Li Ka-shing, formerly the richest man in Asia, says, well, I'm going to sell them. And BlackRock says, well, we're happy to buy them. But then Beijing comes in and says, not so fast. We want to stay there. So notice Albo hasn't spoken about Darwin at all lately. And I'll tell you why. Xiaoqian is all over it. They don't want to give it up. Why don't they want to give it up? Because in the event of a kinetic conflict in our region, they've got that presence there. So our politicians are learning the hard way and they forget very quickly. 99% of our stuff comes by sea trade. And right now, as we speak, Jennifer Parker, who's a retired Navy captain, is giving a talk down in Melbourne, and she's reminded the audience how dependent we are on our supply lines from sea trade. Everything. Especially, and I know it's a very sensitive issue in this room, the supply of fuel. So we're supposed to have 90 days reserve supply, and back in 2023 we ended up having, I think, about 51 days at one point. What worries me is that our politicians, Senator Patterson accepted, and he's just become the shadow defence minister, they're not even talking about this stuff. They're not even talking about it. Xi Jinping says to his people, we're gonna take back Taiwan. But one way or the other, we're going to take back Taiwan. If that happens, air transport, sea transport in our region comes to a grinding halt. It would make the COVID pandemic look like the good old days. And next slide, please. How do we respond? What do we do about it? Can anyone in the audience, don't tell me who that dude is? Personal hero of mine, since I learned about him. I want to do what I can to make sure that as many people in our country know the name Essington Lewis. He was the CEO of BHP. He went to Japan in 1934. He surveilled the military-industrial landscape and red flags went off. 2 years later, he and other captains of industry established the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. They realised that we were too far away from the US and the UK to be provided with Spitfires and other planes, that we had to develop a sovereign capacity here at home. And we did, and it became critical. It became critical, particularly in Kokoda in New Guinea, and it was absolutely important. Where is today's Essington Lewis? That's what I want to know, you know? It's not all doom and gloom. Senator Patterson was talking last week in the papers about we need to have this conversation. We need to stop acting like a peacetime Defence Department and start acting like the situation has changed, because it has changed. Next slide, please. This really disappoints me. Does anyone remember a year ago, and I'm going to wrap up on this slide, because I've got a bit of fire in the belly on this stuff, as you may have gathered. You remember a year ago we had a plan, PLAN, People's Liberation Army Navy, flotilla of 3 vessels. They did a lap of Australia. Remember that? Yeah. And it was in all the papers and on TV. And they did live fire exercises in the Tasman Sea. Why? Why did they do that?
Surveying.
Sorry?
They're surveying, weren't they?
They were sending us a message. They wanted to send us a message. They wanted to say, we've now got this capacity. We're going to flex our muscles, right? Now, around Christmas time, Richard Marles said, we've spotted another flotilla off the Philippines. We're keeping our eye on it. We're keeping our eye on it. They didn't say anything about it. They didn't tell us. In Senate questioning a week or two ago, the head of the ADF, Admiral Hammond, was asked about this flotilla of 4 vessels. It came down past New Guinea, off North Queensland. It came within 5 or 6 nautical miles of our exclusive economic zone. And because the Prime Minister was embarrassed by all the questions a year ago, they decided not to tell us. I don't know about you, but I find that very troubling. we have to have an honest, open conversation with the Australian public about this stuff and stop the censoring. Speaking of which, and to your question earlier on, Andrews last September the 3rd went to Beijing for their big military parade where they showed their latest missiles and all that stuff. He was in the family photo with Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, among other unsavoury characters, to put it mildly. And at the time, Andrews and Allen said, oh, he's a private citizen, none of our business, right? He came back, he's since had a debrief with the Premier, and they've been asked what was discussed, and they don't comment, they will refuse to comment. So I want to make more noise about this stuff going forward, put more pressure on, because I think this is a testing time for our country. And the reason I call my talk and my forthcoming website the China Challenge is because it's as much about us as it is about them. It's as much about how we mobilise, take action, get our act together, to preserve what previous generations gave their lives for. And I know you people who work the land and have done so for generations, I know you've got skin in the game and what it means to you. So with that, I'll wrap up and I'll chuck it open to any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was very comprehensive and 3/4 of an hour, in case you weren't aware of the
I'm
time.
supposed to go for 30 minutes.
But that's quite okay. There was no one asleep and everyone was interested. Any questions from the audience? Hugh, we better get a microphone too. Well, there's a few tractor drivers in here.
Andrew, thanks for your presentation.
Yeah,
Can you
no
talk
worries.
to us a little bit about the Belser Road?
Yeah.
What was behind that?
Yeah.
Is this, we've been Africa and we worked there for 3 years and we've come back and then gone back and visited.
Yeah.
And seen China just take over. Is it just about trying to get capital into these areas and getting countries owning the money, or what's going on?
Yeah, it's a great question. What's your name? Hugh. Great question, Hugh. So this Belt and Road was announced in 2013 by Xi Jinping, and the white...
Stand up.
Sorry.
The audience wants to see.
Did? Wasp. Announced by Xi Jinping in 2013, and the way they window dressed it was thank you. Thanks for that. Do you want to take that now? My assistant, my boss. They dressed it up as the ancient Silk Road from China to, Europe, Marco Polo, across Central Asia. So it was kind of a romantic way they announced it. But it served a number of purposes. Beijing is a very good student of empire, the British Empire, the Roman Empire. So this was a scheme, and it's the largest investment scheme in human history, to put infrastructure around the world. Basically, all roads lead to Beijing. And there's 54 countries in Africa, and 53 of them vote with China at the UN. It's got a massive, as you would have observed, a massive presence in Africa. Now, I know a lot of people in media, and I tried to get attention to this stuff. Oh boy, till I've been blue in the face, with the ABC, why don't you do a thing about China in the world, so what they're doing in Africa, so what they're doing in Latin America, blah, blah, blah. And haven't really been able to but I observe what China does everywhere and try and connect the dots. One of the things was it gave them an opportunity for their excess human capital and the labour to be deployed. But the other thing is if you create critical infrastructure, you get enormous power and leverage where that critical infrastructure goes. So, for example, they built the African Union building in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, which is 70 million people, one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and then they bugged it with Huawei gear. And then the Africans ripped it out and put European gear in. Rare earths and critical minerals, Africa's a big source, so
Somebody asked me that earlier on. In the 80s, Deng Xiaoping said Saudi Arabia has, or the Middle East has oil, China has rare earths. And, this stuff just doesn't make the news. This slow, long game is the enemy of the 24-hour news cycle. It requires a lot of investment of time to follow this, but they got themselves in a position where they became the OPEC of one on rare earths and critical minerals. That's a problem. That's a huge problem, particularly when it comes to defence industry. And they've played that card. They weaponised that card. They did it in 2010 with Japan, and they did it in the last year with the Trump administration. They're now in a position to flex their muscles. The other thing is, when they're in Africa, you talk, people driving around in EVs. Well, the cobalt comes from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and those mines are mined by kids. There's no safety, there's no ethics around that sort of stuff. When PRC goes overseas, it's brutal. So yeah, it's a great question. Thanks.
All right, one from Marshall Rotter up the back here. Stand up, Marshall.
Well done, Andrew. Thank you for your presentation tonight. You mentioned earlier about the oil that we haven't got in this country at the moment. Our politicians don't seem to be real too fussed about it, is because China got them bluffed or what? I mean, if something happens, as you mentioned, overseas, then we've only got about 21 days in this country at the moment, I believe. 21 days is not very long. And the diesel, this country would be on its knees before we even got out of bed and turned the lights on.
Yeah, it's a really important point, Marshall. And, I think we've forgotten, or we haven't learned the lessons from COVID yet. We didn't have a Royal Commission. We didn't really look at how federal and state governments work together. There was a lot of name calling during COVID and all that sort of stuff. But one of the wake-up bombs was our dependence on China for PPE. In 2018, Rosemary Gibson wrote a book called China RX, which talks about how dependent we become on China for chemicals, penicillin, things like that. And so I think the Trump administration is leading the way on looking at supply chain vulnerabilities. And they're also active in trying to stop illegal or grey zone shipping of oil around the world, out of Iran, out of Venezuela, out of Russia, and that sort of thing. So I think what's really disappointing, and this is something I'm going to talk about later on in the week, is that the three stooges, as I like to call them, Carney, Starmer and Albo, just don't seem to get what's going on. We ought to be getting in behind the Americans, and Japan is. Japan's got a new female prime minister, and she's not shy about calling this stuff out. And so her and Trump have a very good relationship. It's not all doom and gloom, but we need to have the conversation. We need to act with urgency. And to your point, Marshall, I messaged Senator Patterson today on that very topic, and I sent him the images from the old World War II fuel reserves things over in Wolseley, just at Wolseley over the border. These are the lessons, the distillery here in Warracknabeal. These are the lessons. Essington Lewis. These are the lessons of World War II. Now, nobody wants things to end up that way. God forbid. But we have to have this conversation.
Okay, Janet Earnshaw.
Yeah, thanks for coming to talk to us today. I have heard, and I may be wrong, that the Uyghur people have been involved in slave labour of building this renewable energy infrastructure. Can you enlighten us? Am I wrong? Am I right?
Yeah. So Michael Danby, who's a former Labor MP, Melbourne Ports member, and was involved in foreign relations and stuff, he and I were invited to a dinner with the Uyghur community in Melbourne because we've spoken up about them. One of the issues is we've got so much stuff made in China, and it's not just high-tech stuff. Now we've got stuff from Shein, from Temu, and they're getting kids data, and they're buying stuff that's cheap and cheerful, and a lot of the time this stuff's not safe, and we don't know how it's been made. has the Chinese worker that made it in a safe environment? Have they been paid an acceptable wage? Have their human rights been respected? Because Chinese workers deserve those things like anybody else. I'm of the view that if you can't go physically to the factory and do an audit at any time, you shouldn't be purchasing from China. And there are other people that have done a deeper dive on the slave labour and prison labour stuff. And it definitely goes on. It definitely goes on at scale. I mean, Xi'an and Timu, there's a big wholesale centre in Jiangsu province, and that stuff ends up going out of the port of Shanghai, which is 10 kilometres out to sea. Everything is on this scale that is so big that people can't compete. Indonesia banned Timu. It was having such an effect on their people. And finally, the Australian retail sector has started to say, this stuff's really hurting us. The University of Wollongong took a Chinese vape and took it to the lab and tested it, and they found it had formaldehyde in it. There's been fast fashion jewellery from some of these e-tailers that are, it's been found to be full of cadmium. There's so much stuff, the volume of stuff is so big, and our governments and regulatory agencies, they're just not on top of it.
Oh, thank you. Russell Schultz.
Yeah, thanks for your speech. I'll ask about trade. China, we trade a lot with China, coal, iron ore, agricultural products, and we buy in things from China. Now, they don't need us really, but we need. If they say we don't want to do a barley or whatever, they'll get it somewhere else. So how do we deal with that issue? Because you mentioned 2008 with the Olympics, when they shut down their factories, our glyphosates and things skyrocketed in price. Right. So the supply from them, it didn't bother them, but it bothered us. How does that trade? Should we trade with other countries more?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's central to Australia-China relations. So I'll be 60 this year, like the big fella here, in a couple of days. And so the first 10 years of my life were, we had no business with China at all. They had the Cultural Revolution until 1976, so, I might not have had as many cheap things to buy, but I grew up, not wanting for anything in Australia. So I think we've always got to bear that in mind, that there are alternatives. Now, I remember having this conversation with a bloke in Sydney in December, and he said 2 words, iron ore. So no country in the world has done as well out of China's opening up to the outside world as Australia. I think they've really underwritten our wealth in a lot of areas. Now, I've got no problem with us selling barley and other commodities to China. That's not a problem at all. And by the way, they're stockpiling a lot of their commodities as well, because they are preparing, and Xi Jinping is preparing his people for stormy seas, as he likes to put it. But it's interesting, they've just started sourcing from Samandu in Guinea and West Africa, which is a huge tract of iron ore. Rio Tinto is involved in that project. Other sources of mine going to Africa say that they're looking, to get more bauxite from West Africa, because they don't want to be dependent on a country that's allied to the United States. Because back to Essington Lewis, the genius of him was we were selling iron ore to the Germans and the Japanese, but Essington Lewis turned that revenue and invested it into building our defence capacity. So I think, I'm not saying trade should stop, not by a long shot.
But we're not investing in our defence through the iron ore.
That could be a real option, and I think the opposite of that is Twiggy Forest. Twiggy Forest, because the Chinese are putting more and more pressure on us over iron ore contracts. They want us to pay for them partly in RMB rather than US dollars, which suits them. And Twiggy Forest is saying, well, the quid pro quo is we should buy more quote-unquote renewables from China. I think he's putting his interest over the national interest. I think that's a conversation that needs to be had, and I hope that people here tonight go out and have this conversation with their friends and at the dinner table and in the pub. And the whole country needs to have this conversation, actually.
Yeah.
So, energy and power is obviously going to be a huge, what is it, a huge issue for us. I find it extraordinary in the debate why is it that members from the coalition side seem to remain so silent on facts like China's building 30 or 40 new power stations a year, and the media will go, we talk about building 1 or 2. One of the other reasons the electric media will bring up is that China's a developing country. Well, you just pointed out that they're building a military command 10 times bigger than the Pentagon, so why can't some of our politicians put these things out?
Yeah, there's been a couple of books in the last year. The Apple book, there's another book called Breakneck, which is about the number of engineers. At the turn of the century, China had about 5 million engineers. Today it's got 18 million engineers. That's a serious scale of brain power. So, half of China's population is very poor and really struggling, but the state keeps channeling resources into these strategic sectors, and nobody else in the world can compete. In the European Union has put tariffs on Chinese-made EVs. The UK hasn't. The UK won't have a domestic car industry in 3 or 5 years from now. It'll be gone because Starmer's not doing anything. On energy, they make too much of everything. And so their export, whether it's EVs, wind turbines, solar panels, they make too much of everything because it's not a market that's driven purely by profit and loss and by the share market. That doesn't mean there aren't aspects of that. The Hong Kong market's been up for the first time in a number of years, particularly around AI companies, but they make too much stuff. And what do they do with that excess production? They want to dump it somewhere. They want to sell it somewhere. And I think people like the Dan Andrews of the world so say, oh, well, these are renewables. If I can make a buck out of these projects, then, good on me. But they're very pragmatic when it comes to energy, but they understand that electricity is the oxygen from which an economy breathes. It's critical. And we sell them a shitload of coal. We don't talk about it, but we do. The government doesn't talk about it, but we do. So it's in my view, it's hypocrisy. We should do what they do. We should go with what's in our national interest. And at the last New Year, Chinese New Year, Xi Jinping did his big speech. He talks about national strength, right? There's only one leader in the Western world that's doing anything remotely similar, and that's Donald Trump. I want to see an Australia that's strong. I want to see an Australia that is not easily pushed around, And I want to see an Australia where our people love our country and have our back, So, I hear you, mate.
Right, Julie.
Hi, Julie.
This is not my question, but your last comment, you want to see an Australian that doesn't get pushed around. Do you think that is possible with the current economic and government options or position that we currently have? That's not my question, but you can answer.
Okay. Yeah, so that book, Beijing Rules, by Bethany Allen, it's a great book, I highly recommend it. Beijing puts a price on our behaviour. So, when we asked for an inquiry into COVID, we were in the sin bin. We got yellow card in the naughty corner. 20 billion worth of, trade sanctions on us, which hurt. I mean, if you were a cray fisherman in Tassie or SA and you had a family and a mortgage, it hurt, So they know how to, that's what I mean by being pushed around. The other thing I mean by being pushed around is they send 4 Navy ships on the lap of Australia. We should be giving them some company. Senator Patterson's talking about missile defences and stuff like that, which we don't have. So we have gaps that need to be addressed. That's what I mean. And Jennifer Parker's been talking about it down in Melbourne tonight, we need to invest more. We have a proud history of making a lot of things in our country, including shipbuilding, and we need to have a certain amount. We're so dependent on seaborne trade. People ask me, what happens if would the PLA attack Australia? They don't need to. If there's a naval blockade to our north and our shipping channels are cut off, they bring us to our knees in a matter of weeks. So we need to hedge against that.
I think they can shut down a lot of other things quicker too. So my question is getting back to the renewables around here. It's to do with the caveats. So before a project's even up and running, you have landowners that have a caveat on their land by projects. Let's use West Wind. And it says prohibited anything not in our best interest, which basically equates to they now have 51% power on your land. Now that company can now on-sell that to anybody. So the project here is about 28,000 hectares, the one at Wilkes is about 11,000 hectares. So it doesn't take long to add up the acreage, or the hectares, and then you don't know who they're going to on-sell the projects to, whether they ever become an actual running project. There seems to be no clause when those caveats get removed. And then you've got the issue of decommissioning, potentially $1 million per turbine. You've got 20 million worth to decommission turbines. Is the bank going to lend you that money? No. So the owner of the caveat possibly does, which is possibly going to be Chinese owned at the time. Hand wave to get into very cheap land because all they've had to do is promise a few dollars, get a signature. Happy days for them.
It's a really raw deal, and you know, I learned a lot from being up here at the meeting a couple of weeks ago. And to your point earlier on, there are politicians in Liberal seats in Melbourne, especially the seats that were taken by the Teals, where they're like, "Oh, we can't say anything negative about renewables because we'll lose our seat," you know. And that's a very tightly contested seat where Jess Wilson is. And I live in Goldstone, which is Tim Wilson, and I liked him, good mates with Tim, but he was very cagey about the whole net zero thing. I think there's a number of problems here. I think people on land have been pushed around by Spring Street is one issue, and I think you guys need voices in the burbs in the city to help other people understand what you have to deal with and what you have to put up with and the raw deal that you're getting. You know, I left last time feeling very angry. I don't see this as a city-country thing at all. I think we're interconnected. You people provide the food and fibre, without which we don't live. We need you. We're part of the same family, and we need to start talking like it. You know. So I mean, I think the situation's outrageous, but I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to help people in the city understand it and get in politicians' faces. You know, I don't mean in a rude way, but you know, present the fact sheets and help them understand what's going on.
Yep. Yeah.
Thanks, Ross. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, no worries. Good to see you.
Stuart, sorry I was a bit
Stuart,
late on
no worries.
up from Ballarat because I heard you were speaking, so I sort of thought I'd come up and say good day.
Good on you. Thanks.
So this is an area of interest of mine, and it's been an area of interest for a little while. So I just want to make a few statements and you know, I can respond to them, and then I'll finish up with the question if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So about mid last year, people might have seen a TV program and it was talking about China's Belt and Road initiatives, in particularly Indonesia, which is you know just to the north of Australia, and in particular their copper mining interests in Indonesia. Now the effect of Chinese workers going into Indonesia.
I think you meant nickel though.
Nickel, wasn't it? Nickel or copper.
Nickel.
So the effect of that was that it's all Chinese workers.
Yep.
There are Indonesian workers,
Yep.
but they do the low value jobs. Safety was a big issue.
Yep.
A lot of deaths in the mine.
Yep.
A lot of ill health in the miners that were native to Indonesia. But the effect on Australia was there was tens of millions of dollars worth of mining projects that either were shut down or the investment in those projects went on hold because of that. So that's a direct effect because of China's influence and activity in Indonesia. You mentioned Twiggy Forrest. Well, I've got a little bit of interest in Twiggy Forrest Company, and last year he borrowed just forget the sum, but it was in the tens of millions of dollars of money from China in R&D for investment in Australia. So that's another thing that, you know, it's already happening. And then my local MP, so I live in a Labor seat down Thurrock, my local MP did nothing to recognise or celebrate Australia Day, but her Facebook page was full of things to celebrate the Chinese Lunar New Year, and that raised a bit of a red flag with me. Why are we recognising Chinese Lunar New Year and yet we can't recognise Australia Day? So finally the question. I'm someone that never really went to Melbourne very much. I did a little bit back in my uni days, and then for the last 30 years I've pretty much tried to keep away from the place. But for other reasons I've had to go to Melbourne a fair bit in the last 12 months, and that's to stand on the steps of Parliament House and protest. And you get on the trams, you walk up the streets, the percentage of people of Chinese descent in Melbourne astounds me. And I'm not anti-Chinese people coming to Australia, but I just wonder how much influence China, as in the CCP, might have through those people who are here in our country, because there is a lot of them.
Very, very good points, which a lot of people have observed. First of all, on Indonesian nickel, 2,000 Australians lost their jobs in WA nickel mines because of Indonesian nickel. And Liam Bartlett, who was up here the other day, Ross, Liam did very good work on Spotlight on the Indonesian nickel industry, and you're spot on. So it's China's invested, and once again they figured out a process by throwing the resources that they put to this stuff on processing nickel, and they went into Sulawesi in Indonesia, which was pristine, beautiful, tropical, you know, villages and fishing villages and all that sort of stuff. Their safety record's been horrendous. There's no, you know, when PRC Inc. comes to play, there's no transparency. I mean, this mineral sand stuff that's going on in this part of the state, you get all these PRC interests. Some of them are citizens, Australian citizens. Doesn't necessarily mean they're loyal to the country. There's all sorts of convoluted and complex organisational ownership structures to these that are designed to create opacity. And Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer's onto this. I mean, they've tried to keep PRC Inc. out of rare earths and critical minerals assets in Australia. He's told them so in no uncertain terms. They don't take no for an answer. That is just the nature of the beast. That's what we've got to deal with in China. I've heard it a million times. They say, woman's or woman, we go by the back door. They'll try and find a loophole and they'll keep going. On Melbourne CBD, you know, I've been in Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne CBD in the last 6 months. And, you know, I was an expat for a long period of time. I know it feels like I've been a minority. And there are times when you come back and you go, hey, this isn't the Australia I grew up with. I think it's akin to, I like to use the analogy of cordial. If you put too much concentrate in too quickly, it doesn't taste very good. You know, we like immigrants from all around the world. We're Australians are fair-minded, welcoming people. But if you have too many people from a particular foreign group coming too quickly, it's not just Australia, it's anywhere in the world, then people are going to feel a little bit out of sorts, you know. And Melbourne CBD, the city of Melbourne, has a very high ethnic Chinese population, and local government, the city of Melbourne, in their elections, if you want to vote, you don't have to be a citizen, you don't have to be a PR, you only need to own a flat or be renting a flat in the CBD, and you can vote in the CBD elections. Now, the city of Melbourne is not just for Melburnians, it's for all Victorians, for all Australians. And this happens in other different areas, and China has a strategy to influence at a subnational level, at a state level, and in Beijing rules, they go into great detail of how they've done this at local government level in the US and other jurisdictions. I've met local councillors in Australia that have had terrible experiences with PRC representatives here. and they're the only country that has an embassy in Canberra that invites local government people to functions. They're the only people that do it, and they do it for a reason. So that's why Clive Hamilton's book is called Silent Invasion. And there's no respect for our sovereignty at all, you know. So, and you know what? Good Aussie Chinese people are okay to talk about this. They're okay with it because they're patriotic Australians, but not everybody is. But this is a conversation we have to have, and our politicians are too gutless to talk about on both sides.
All right, we'll have a couple more questions, then we better wrap it up, I think. But short questions, quick answers, and we'll get a couple more in.
Thanks, Andrew, for today. Just a quick question. How, as a nation, are we able to, say, get across to everyone in our country with the politicians, so many won't give us the truth, and then our media won't support us either. So how, as a nation, are we supposed to get this out to support everyone here today and everyone else in our country?
It's a great question. It's something I think about all the time. It's hard. You know, when I do podcasts and stuff, when I speak to the Americans, I say, look, Team Freedom, we're getting smashed in the share of voice, you know. Their influence, how covert it is, and all that sort of stuff. You know, it's a battle, but I think I kind of view myself as the first dick on the dance floor, you know what I mean? You go out and feel like an idiot, you know, in the music, and then a couple other people come out and join you, and you go, you see where I'm going with this? You know, it's a battle, because 7, 9 and 10, none of them have correspondence in Asia, let alone China. And, you know, right now the big story is the ISIS brides, right? Well, it's 20 ladies and a bunch of kids. It's not a national security threat. China is a superpower with a very deliberate strategy. And we don't talk about it. So it's a huge issue.
Okay, you're satisfied, Debbie, that one. That was excellent. Well done, Andrew. We have one on the back here from David Droge.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation and answers so far tonight. Look, Madam Jacinta is aggressively trying to attract a lot of data centres to the state of Victoria at the moment, the condition of which is that it's all to be powered by renewable energy. Do you have an opinion on that, and is that a significant, is there a Chinese angle to this?
That's the first I've heard of it, actually.
That's the first I've heard of Victoria wanting to attract data centres. I know there's some in New South Wales, but on that point, when Albo was, remember the last election, you know, the Labor Party was going on about three-eyed fish, you know, from nuclear power and things like that. I mean, we already have nuclear power to some degree because we have Lucas sites in Sydney that serves the nuke medicine market. But Albo was in Washington and Seattle en route to some summit, and he went to visit Microsoft, and the CEO of Microsoft was talking about the need for energy for data centers and cloud computing, which is, and through AI, is going ballistic, right? And that's why I had that slide up there on China's energy. I think either they don't understand what's going on, or they don't understand the dynamic, or the size and scale that industry requires. But you know, if we're dependent on so-called renewables, I mean, some of the stuff I see in the news, honestly, you know, after all my years overseas, I come back and I think, wow, the quality, the level of governance. There was a thing at Hastings in Western Port Bay where they were going to announce an offshore wind turbine thing. You know how many offshore wind turbine things there are on the coast of Australia at the moment? Have a guess? Yeah, 0. And you know, somebody asked the minister, what's it going to cost? She said, oh, I don't know at this point. We haven't got to that bit yet, you know. I mean, to me, the level of competence among some of our ministers is frightening, frankly. So, but I haven't heard that about data centres.
Hang on, Ray. We've got to make everyone here. It's no good for old trench drivers that can't hear. Yeah,
So, currently the Labor government in Victoria is trying to attract significantly more data centres than what would be our requirement from the national security perspective. And the implications of that because they want renewable power, basically new growth in data centres is chewing up all the wind farm capacity that they're talking about building in this area before they've even built a wind farm.
Yeah, we're also subsidising made in China, which to me is complete nuts. So China had an enormous, I could do a presentation just on the car industry in China vis-a-vis the rest of the world, and the PRC government has subsidised the car industry there at a consumer purchase level and at an industry level, and our government is providing subsidies on top of that, basically trying to influence your vehicle choice, which I think they've got no business doing, particularly given the level of debt in our country. To me, it's madness. Why would you subsidise something that the PRC has already subsidised when they've ripped off the rest of the world's technology and the Western automakers? Germany's a classic example of this. A friend of mine wrote a book called Germany and China. The Germans went into China early. They've handed over so much technology, and now the German auto industry is under threat. Volkswagen's sacking people in Germany because they can't compete. It's like the same play. You see it again and again. Pan Zhenwei is the father of quantum computing in China. Did all his work at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. Brought out his PhDs from China, and then when the time was right, he packed it up, took it back to China. Dankeschön, Deutschland, taxpayer. Auf Wiedersehen. We see this play, I've seen it a million times. When are we going to wake up and put our own interests first?
But it happened in the 70s with Jersey cows, like Headers and Merino sheep, like basically carted the best of those over to China and went away our industry suffered.
We've contributed to their being able to make wine, things like that. It's crazy. I learned early in my career at BHP that Clinton Dines went on to become president of BHP China, and he used to say to me, China's being rude back. You don't have to do the deal. You can say, this doesn't work for me, and you go away, But they've been very skillful in leveraging the 1.4 billion. And then I have other people saying, including ex-diplomats saying, why don't we care about the Vietnamese Communist Party? Why are we always worried about the Chinese? I'll tell you why. Because China's 14 times the size of Vietnam, that's why. Vietnam's not going to rule the world, so keep making the same mistakes, not learning from the past. We want to reset relations, So.
Yeah, Andrew, thanks very much for your presentation. It's been really eye-opening. I think a lot of people may not realise what's been going on. And that's slow creep, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. One question, World Economic Forum and their influences compared to China and whether they sort of marry up together.
It's a great question, actually. Thanks. So there's this school of thought that talks about the so-called globalists, and Beijing has been very close to the United Nations, so it's got in and it's corrupted the United Nations to a great degree. If you want to have an empire, you want to be able to control the standards, the gauge, the frequency, all the standards. So that's been a big effort of theirs in the United Nations. They've also put pressure on them to hand over names of dissidents and Uyghurs and things like that. With regard to the World Economic Forum, which I have very little time for, same sort of deal. These globalists, they think they've got this sort of superior infrastructure over the top of the nation state. And so loyalty to country doesn't mean anything anymore. You're a global, you're all above all that sort of stuff. And I think, the Epstein stuff and all that is all part of that. And I think Trump, they've gone to Davos but the stuff that they've said at Davos has been a real affront to that kind of globalist mentality. I think the Trump administration, Trump says some dumb things sometimes and he's a bit transactional, but him and Rubio in particular, Elbridge Colby, thank God for those guys. if Harris had won the last US election, God forbid. I mean, I think it would have been the end of the free world and the Western world as we know it. You know, yeah.
All right, any further questions? I know I'm taking up a little bit of time, but
That's right.
Andrew's got a little bit of skill and experience.
That's right.
Do the Chinese-made cars, refrigerators and TVs spy on Australians?
That's a very good question. One of the concepts in the PRC, they have a very big cyber force, and in the September 3 big military parade, we saw a couple of flags. We saw the PLA rocket force for the first time. We saw the cyber force under their flag for the first time. It's estimated they have about 500,000 in their cyber army, and the Ministry of State Security, the MSS, is bigger than the FBI and the CIA put together. They have everything with China. The numbers are ridiculous. When it comes to electric vehicles, they're smartphones on wheels. The software, the code's all written in China, right? So, you know, they know where you've driven if they want to know that. The question is, would they weaponize it, and under what sort of circumstances would they weaponize it? So there was an episode of US 60 Minutes a few months ago, and they went up to a town of about 20,000 in Maine, and they interviewed the guy at the local water utility, and he said, we found this sleeping presence in our IT system. So that'll sit there and they'll deploy it at the time of their choosing. Think about this. If there's a contingency on Taiwan, what are the people in Middletown, Maine going to be worried about if they have no water supply? Are they going to be worried about Taiwan or their water supply? And so, you know, I've got a mate in Austin, Texas, Michael Lucci, and he goes around to all the capitals in the US and advises them at a state level and says, you don't want, and our security agencies here will say the same thing, you don't want PRC Inc. in your critical infrastructure, in water, in electricity, in transport and stuff like that. In the UK, they had a big nuclear power plant that was being built with the Chinese. They've tried to get the Chinese out of that. But every time there's a change of government, it's like a bunch of fresh, Beijing goes, oh, it's a bunch of fresh bunnies. They have no idea. We're going to take them to the slaughter. So it's really, they've got continuity. They've got continuity, you know, since 1949. They've had a 100-year strategy. 2027 will be 100 years since the founding of the PLA. Xi Jinping says to them, we want you to have the capacity to be able to take Taiwan by force by 2027. By 2049, we want to have the world's most powerful military.
I think the PLA is the People's Liberation Army, which is, Marshall's got one too, but Tracy first. Nice place.
Thanks, Andrew. Just on that, do you think that they are going to take action in 2027 on Taiwan?
That is the most important question of the evening because of the consequence for Australia. Now, when we had the Voice to Parliament referendum, our Prime Minister was asked on 60 Minutes, what keeps you up at night? He said, the war in Ukraine. That's not what keeps me up at night. Have we not learned anything from Gallipoli? Ukraine is a European conflict. Important and tragic and consequential as it is, it's not a direct threat to Australia. Curtin brought our boys home from North Africa. Taiwan is in our neck of the woods, it's in our time zone. And, you know, we're very dependent on maritime trade. So, will he do it? Will he do it? They want to do it without military means. And they're trying to do that politically. The current head of the KMT, or Nationalist Party in Taiwan, has been courted by Beijing. They've got spies all over the place. They're hook, line and sinker. They're trying to make Taiwanese people say, it's inevitable, we may as well capitulate. But the fact of the matter is, the people in Taiwan, and I've lived there, and they're great people, they choose their own leaders. They've got 3 times the GDP per capita wealth of the mainland. You know, they're the world centre for advanced semiconductors, TSMC. They have a free press. Why on earth would they want to be ruled by Beijing? And if they are taken over, a democracy of 23 million people in the Indo-Pacific, then we as Australians, we need to think, what are the consequences of Taiwan being successfully annexed by China? I'll tell you what it means. It means Japan goes nuclear, the United States withdraws all the way back to Hawaii, Southeast Asia, 600 million people, falls under Beijing's sway. Where does that leave Australia and New Zealand? Not in a very good place. So whether we like it or not, we're in this. We need to start talking about it.
Andrew, maybe this might be the last question, but when I was talking to you a week or so ago, you made mention of a movie where all the Teslas went crazy, and I think that might reinforce what you were talking about, the BYD case. Maybe you might just finish up on that.
Yeah.
There was a movie, I can't remember the name of it, and
it's called Leave the World Behind. It's on Netflix. It was produced by the Obamas, actually. Julia Roberts, Ethan Hawke, Mahershala Ali. Quite interesting. There's a bunch of Teslas and they'll go haywire. In China, there was a bunch of BYD customers and BYD, just a little backstory on the cars. 10 years or so ago, so BYD started out making batteries for mobile phones, and then they bought a car company and said, we'll figure out how to make cars. China leads the world in the battery technology through BYD and a company called, I forget what they're called, it'll come back to me. Anyway, the two biggest battery companies, and they're the world leaders. There was a big European company called Volt, went belly up. Once again, too hard to compete. 10 years ago, Elon Musk was laughing at BYD. You know, Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger put a few $100 million into it. That stake's worth 7 or 8 billion now. Elon Musk is not laughing now. But Tesla, the Chinese went to California and studied Tesla. And then he set up the Gigafactory in China. And Elon Musk, maybe he would do the same thing today, but he said, I don't believe in patents. I don't believe in patents. And for the Chinese, that was Christmas. And we're going to go and we're going to hoover it all up. And look where they are now, you know. So, and once again, if the software is controlled from China, like you update your Apple iPhone or whatever, they can put in a software update, they can put in malware, there's a risk. And would they weaponize it at the time of their suiting? Well, I don't know what you think, but yeah, they would. And it's a conversation we've got to have. I'm heartbroken. My beloved Tigers are now sponsored by Great Wall Motor. You know, nobody asked me. They used to be sponsored by Jeep. Oh well, you win some, you lose some.
All right, well, thank you very much, and I'd like you to put your hands together for Andrew.